Be very careful, because this is not the kind of fear that fades with time. This is the kind of fear that digs deep into the soul, lurking in the hidden corners of our mind. Carl Jung, the pioneer of analytical psychology, spent his life studying the deepest fears and obsessions of human beings. And in all his work, there was one thing about women that he feared more than death itself. It wasn't her appearance. It wasn't her voice. It wasn't even her actions. It was something far more powerful. Something few men dare to acknowledge. A dark pattern that lives beneath the surface, so silent and subtle that you almost don't see it until it's already controlling everything. This is the type of power that doesn't shout. It doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't demand. It simply wraps itself around your psyche and slowly consumes your sense of self. In this video, you'll discover what that one fear was for Carl Jung and how it can become your greatest weakness. If you understand this, you protect yourself from illusions, manipulation, and the slow erosion of your identity. But if you ignore it, it will haunt you. Stay until the end, because this is not just about women or relationships. It's about how your mind can be both your greatest weapon and your greatest prison. The shadow she doesn't see, the danger of unconscious power. She doesn't show up in your life as a warning. She arrives as a gentle breeze, almost like a promise. She seems tender, sweet, and safe. But beneath that calm surface lies a force Carl Jung spent his entire life trying to understand. The shadow. You see, Jung taught us that the human mind isn't just the thoughts we think or the feelings we admit to ourselves. It's also everything we bury, everything we're too afraid to face. And in some women, this buried chaos doesn't stay quiet. It seeps out in every interaction, every smile, every carefully chosen word. This is why Jung feared her more than death. Not because she's evil, but because she's unaware. Unaware of her own power. Unaware of how her charm can become a weapon. Unaware of how her unconscious wounds twist themselves into the very dynamics of love, connection, and trust. She doesn't dominate with rage. She doesn't control with force. She does it with silence, with sudden withdrawals, with those tiny shifts in tone and expression that make you question yourself, question your sanity, question your worth. And you don't see it at first because you're mesmerized, because she seems to understand you in ways no one else ever did, because her attention feels like oxygen when you're starving for validation. But over time, what felt like intimacy begins to feel like confusion. What seemed like affection turns into emotional traps, silent tests you're never quite sure you're passing. Jung saw this as the power of the unconscious feminine shadow. He called it a vortex. It doesn't just pull in the woman herself. It pulls in everyone close to her. It feeds on your need to be seen, to be loved, to be chosen, until you're so lost in the game that you can't remember who you were before her. And the most dangerous part? She doesn't even know she's doing it. Because the shadow isn't about malice. It's about survival. It's about patterns so deeply buried that they operate automatically, turning every interaction into a test of your patience, your strength, your sanity. If you don't see it for what it is, you will call it love. You will call it fate. You will tell yourself that this is just how relationships work, when in truth it's a silent war between your boundaries and her unconscious need to control. And that's why this is so important to understand. Because once you see the shadow, you can choose clarity. You can choose self-respect. You can choose to step back from the chaos and reclaim every piece of yourself you lost, trying to keep her happy. The subtle war for your mind, how she hijacks your sense of self. What makes her power so disarming is how invisible it is. She doesn't come to you with threats or demands. She comes with smiles, gentle words, and the illusion of safety. But in every smile, every soft touch, there's a quiet message. Prove yourself to me. It starts small. A sigh, a pause, a look that says more than words ever could. And before you know it, you're recalibrating your entire world just to avoid her disapproval. You're tiptoeing through conversations, second-guessing every word, shrinking your truth in the hope that it might keep her close. Carl Jung understood that this is how the unconscious works. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It doesn't command. It suggests. And it does so in ways so subtle that you don't even realize it's happening until you're already lost inside her emotional maze. You start thinking it's about you, that if you could just be better, more patient, more understanding, you could finally make her happy. But that's the trap, because her happiness isn't yours to fix. It's the chaos of her own shadow, and no matter how much you give, it will never be enough to fill the emptiness inside her. And here's the truth Jung wanted us to see. The real danger isn't her. It's what happens to you when you forget yourself in her emotional storm. When you abandon your boundaries. When you trade your peace for the illusion of love. That's why it's not enough to understand this intellectually. You need to feel it in your bones. You need to anchor yourself in clarity so that no matter how charming, how intoxicating, how magnetic she seems, you never lose sight of your own truth. This is why I created the SIM method, a 5-minute daily practice to clear mental chaos, integrate your shadow, and protect your mind from these unconscious dynamics. Because in the end, it's not just about seeing the danger, it's about having the tools to step back from it. You'll find the link in the pinned comment below, because the moment you claim your clarity, the spell begins to break. The hidden war, why her power feels so inevitable. At first, it feels like chemistry, like destiny, like you finally found the missing piece you didn't even know you were looking for. She seems to see you. She seems to understand you in ways that feel almost spiritual. And in the glow of her attention, you feel more alive than you have in years. But that feeling? It's not intimacy. It's not connection. It's the hook. Carl Jung taught us that the most dangerous patterns in relationships are the ones that begin as a mirror, a perfect reflection of your hidden longings, your unmet needs. That's why her power doesn't come from aggression or direct control. It comes from how she reflects back to you the parts of yourself you've been starving for. In her attention, you see your potential. In her eyes, you see the man you wish you were. In her soft words, you feel a promise that if you could just hold on to this, you'd finally feel whole. But that's the illusion. Because the moment you start depending on her for that feeling, she has you. Not because she's consciously plotting to manipulate you, but because her shadow is playing out a script she doesn't even know she's following. This is the war Jung tried to warn us about, the battle between what's real and what's projected, between who you truly are and who you become when you're desperate to be chosen. And here's the most painful part. The longer you stay in that dynamic, the more you lose yourself in the story she's weaving. The more you trade your truth for her comfort. The more you shape your words, your actions, your entire identity, just to keep her attention. But the cost is always the same. Your peace. Your sovereignty. The quiet knowing of who you are when no one else is in the room. This is why Jung believed that the real work is not about changing her or fixing her shadow. It's about waking up to your own, seeing how easily your soul can be hijacked by the fantasy of someone else's validation, how quickly you can trade your power for the illusion of love. Because once you see this, truly see it, you realize that the real danger was never her at all. It was the part of you that was willing to abandon yourself to be chosen. The anatomy of the trap. How her shadow consumes you. It doesn't start with loud arguments or obvious red flags. It starts with subtle shifts, tiny hesitations that you almost can't name, but you feel them. You feel them in the tightening of your chest when she pauses too long before answering a simple question. In the way her smile fades for just a second too long after you assert a boundary. In the silence that follows when you express something real. Carl Jung knew that the unconscious doesn't announce itself. It seeps in quietly, weaving its patterns through moments that seem insignificant. That's why you don't notice the trap being set, is because it doesn't look like a trap at all. It looks like chemistry, like a soulmate, like fate. At first, she is everything you ever wanted. Attentive, affectionate, endlessly curious about your thoughts and dreams. She mirrors your passions, amplifies your confidence, and makes you feel like the most important man in the world. And in her eyes, you see the version of yourself you always hoped to become. But slowly, imperceptibly, the energy begins to shift. Her validation becomes conditional. Her moods become unpredictable. One day she's warm and affectionate, the next she's distant, cold, impossible to read. And because you're so invested, so hooked by the version of yourself you see reflected in her attention, you start twisting yourself into knots to get that warmth back. You start shrinking your truth. You downplay your needs. You censor your feelings. All because you think, if you can just be more patient, more understanding, more perfect, you can bring her back to the way she was in the beginning. But that's the secret. The way she was in the beginning wasn't real. It was a projection, yours and hers. A fantasy built on unconscious wounds and unspoken fears. A dance of shadows that felt like love because it was intense, because it was consuming, because it demanded everything from you and made you feel like that was the price of connection. Jung warned that when the unconscious takes over, relationships become theaters for our deepest fears and desires. And in this dynamic, her shadow becomes the stage on which you play out your own. Her silent withdrawals trigger your need for validation. Her coldness feeds your fear of rejection. Her fleeting warmth becomes the drug you chase, always hoping for another hit, another moment of feeling seen, even if it's only for a heartbeat. You tell yourself that this is passion, that real love is supposed to be this intense. You convince yourself that if you can just endure the lows, the highs will be worth it. That if you can just figure out what she needs, you'll finally feel secure. But the more you give, the more she takes. The more you bend, the more she demands. Because the real dynamic isn't about love, it's about power, and not in the obvious sense of control or domination. It's the power of being needed, the power of being the center of your world, the power of knowing that you're willing to lose yourself just to keep her from leaving. This is what Jung meant when he said that the unconscious, when left unexamined, becomes a force of its own. It doesn't care about your well-being. It doesn't care about truth. It only cares about its own survival, even if that means destroying everything in its path. And here's the brutal truth. She may not even know she's doing it, because this isn't about malice. It's about her own shadow, the parts of her that learn to survive by testing, by withdrawing, by making you prove over and over again that you're worthy of her attention. The parts of her that can't feel safe without control. The parts of her that can't rest until she knows you're hooked. But her shadow isn't the only one at play. Your own unconscious wounds are just as involved. the parts of you that crave validation, the parts that confuse intensity with intimacy, the parts that believe love has to be earned through sacrifice and self-abandonment. This is why you stay, even when everything in you knows it's wrong. Because on some level it feels familiar. It feels like home. Not the home you deserve, but the home you've known. The home of your oldest wounds, the home of your unspoken fears. Jung saw this dynamic again and again in his patients. The gravitational pull of the shadow, the way it distorts reality and traps you in cycles that drain your spirit and consume your peace. And he knew that the only way out was to make the unconscious conscious, to name the pattern, to see it for what it is, not what you wish it could be. Because once you see it, the spell begins to break. You start to notice the little ways you twist yourself to keep her happy. You see the moments you silence your truth to avoid her coldness. You recognize the patterns of your own mind, the stories you tell yourself to justify staying, the ways you gaslight yourself into believing that your discomfort is your fault. And in that clarity, something shifts. The power she had over you begins to dissolve. The need to be chosen, to be seen, to be validated by someone who can't even see herself, it loses its hold. Because the truth is, no matter how much you love her, no matter how deeply you want to be the one who finally makes her feel safe, it's not your job. It's not your burden to carry her shadow or to fix her wounds. Your only responsibility is to yourself, to your own clarity, to your own peace, to your own soul. And when you reclaim that, truly, fiercely, unapologetically, the entire dynamic changes. You stop negotiating with her moods. You stop trying to decode her silences. You stop playing a game you never agreed to. You remember that your worth was never in her approval, that your value was never in how well you could bend yourself to fit her needs, that the love you're really seeking isn't out there at all. It's inside you, waiting for you to come home to it. Because in the end, the most dangerous part of her power isn't her shadow. It's the way it makes you forget your own. And the moment you remember it, the moment you stand in the quiet, unwavering truth of who you are, her shadow no longer has any power over you at all. The illusion of control. Why you keep playing the game. You tell yourself you're not controlled. You tell yourself you're choosing to stay, that you're the one in charge of how deep this goes. You even tell yourself you can walk away anytime you want. But deep down, you feel the truth. It's not you in control anymore. It's the dynamic. Carl Jung warned us that the most dangerous illusions are the ones that feel like freedom. The ones that let you believe you're the master of your choices, when in reality, you're just following a script your unconscious mind has rehearsed 1,000 times before. You stay not because you want to, but because you're afraid of what it means if you leave. Afraid of the emptiness you might feel when her voice is no longer in your head, her moods no longer dictating your day. Afraid that without the highs and lows of her attention, you'll feel nothing at all. This is how the unconscious traps you, by convincing you that the chaos is passion, that the drama is intensity, that the uncertainty is love. And the more you convince yourself that this is what love is supposed to feel like, the more you give. Your time, your energy, your peace. But here's the brutal truth. It's never enough. No matter how much you give, no matter how much you bend, it will never satisfy the bottomless hunger of her shadow, or your own. Because what's really being fed here isn't love. It's a cycle of validation and withdrawal, of hope and disappointment. A cycle that doesn't end until you decide to stop playing the game altogether. You start to notice how she tests your boundaries, not with words but with silence. How she gauges your loyalty, not with questions, but with distance. how she keeps you off balance, so you're always working to prove yourself. And every time you rise to that challenge, you feed the dynamic. Jung saw this in every relationship that turned toxic. The more you try to control the chaos, the more it controls you. Because the unconscious doesn't play by the rules of logic or fairness. It plays by the rules of survival, and it will do anything to keep you hooked. It's in the way you start second-guessing yourself, doubting your instincts, silencing the part of you that knows this isn't right. It's in the way you shrink your truth just a little bit more every day, until one morning you look in the mirror and barely recognize the person staring back. The hardest part to admit? You're not here because of her. You're here because of something inside you, something that needed to feel chosen, something that mistook her approval for love, something that believed your worth was measured by how much you could endure. And that's where the real danger lives, in the part of you that thinks this is what love is supposed to feel like, in the part that tells you to keep giving, keep hoping, keep sacrificing, even when your soul is screaming for you to walk away. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life, and you will call it fate. This is fate disguised as love. This is your own shadow pretending to be devotion. This is the part of you that learned, somewhere long ago, that love means losing yourself to someone else's needs. But it doesn't have to be this way, because the moment you see the pattern, the moment you name it for what it is, not love, but dependency, you break the spell. You start to remember who you were before you met her, the man who didn't flinch at his own truth, the man who didn't need someone else's attention to feel whole, the man who knew that real love never asks you to abandon yourself. And in that remembering, you find your power again. The power to walk away, not because you stopped caring, but because you started caring about yourself more. The power to reclaim the parts of you that were lost in her shadows. The power to choose peace over chaos, truth over fantasy, self-respect over the illusion of connection. Because in the end, that's the only control that matters. The control you have over yourself, over your choices, over your willingness to see the truth, no matter how painful it might be. And once you claim that control, the game ends. Not because she changed, but because you did. The cost of denial. Why the unconscious always collects its debt. You might think that ignoring these patterns will make them go away. You tell yourself that if you just stay patient, stay kind, stay understanding, the storms will calm. But the truth is, the unconscious never stays buried. It always finds a way to collect its debt, and it does so in ways you never expect. At first, it's small. A moment of self-doubt when you didn't have it before. A feeling of tension in your gut that you can't quite name. A sense that you're always just a little bit off balance, like you're standing on shaky ground. But over time, those small cracks become chasms, and you realize that every moment you spent denying what you felt, every time you silenced that quiet voice inside you, you were paying a price. Carl Jung saw this again and again. The cost of denying the unconscious is always your own clarity. Because the longer you pretend not to see, the more you lose your ability to trust yourself. You stop listening to your intuition. You start explaining away the red flags. You tell yourself you're overreacting, that you're too sensitive, that if you could just do better, everything would be okay. But here's the truth. No amount of patience can fix a pattern that lives in the shadows. No amount of love can heal what someone else refuses to face in themselves. And no amount of sacrifice can save you from the slow erosion of your own spirit. You start to see it in the way your energy shifts. How you're always tired, even when you've done nothing. How your mind can't rest, always spinning in circles, trying to solve a problem that doesn't have a solution. How you find yourself feeling small in your own life, like you're living in the background of someone else's story. And the worst part? You blame yourself. You tell yourself it's your fault for not being strong enough, patient enough, loving enough. You carry the weight of her moods, her wounds, her chaos, as if it's your responsibility to fix it all. But it never was. Because the truth is, the unconscious patterns she lives by have nothing to do with you. They were there long before you met her, and they'll still be there long after you're gone. The real question is, how long will you keep paying the price for someone else's war with themselves? How long will you keep trading your peace for the illusion that you can save her from her own shadows? Jung said that the unconscious isn't just in the mind. It lives in the body too. And you feel it in your bones when something isn't right. You feel it in the heaviness in your chest, the tightness in your throat, the constant low hum of anxiety that never fully goes away. Those aren't just feelings. They're messages, warnings. Your body's way of telling you the truth your mind doesn't want to face. The longer you ignore them, the more they grow. Because the unconscious isn't patient. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about your excuses or your justifications. It only cares about balance, about truth, about making sure that whatever is denied in the mind finds a way to be seen in the body. And if you don't listen, that's when the real cost shows itself. In the sleepless nights, in the restless mind, in the hollow feeling that no amount of her attention can ever fill. Because the truth is, every time you abandon yourself to keep her happy, you teach yourself that your feelings don't matter, that your needs aren't important, that your truth is a threat to her comfort. And so you bury it, over and over, until you can't even remember what it felt like to speak your mind without fear. But it doesn't have to be this way, because there's another truth that Jung understood. And it's the most liberating of all. The moment you decide to see the pattern, to name it, to stand in the quiet power of your own clarity, you stop paying the price. You stop living in reaction to her moods. You stop carrying her chaos on your shoulders. You stop shrinking yourself to fit a role you were never meant to play. Because the moment you see it for what it is, not love, not destiny, not fate, but a pattern born of her shadows and fed by your silence, you reclaim everything that was lost in the confusion. You reclaim your voice, your boundaries, your peace. And in that reclamation, you discover something you may have forgotten. That real love doesn't ask you to become less. It doesn't ask you to abandon yourself. It doesn't live in the shadows of someone else's wounds. Real love lives in the light, and it begins the moment you decide to step out of the darkness. And here's the raw truth from this channel. The real tragedy isn't her power. It's the way so many men willingly trade their own peace for the fleeting illusion of her affection. At the end of the day, we believe that the most dangerous thing isn't her shadow. It's your decision to ignore the quiet knowing inside you that you deserve better. So if you take one thing from this video, let it be this. Your soul was never meant to be a playground for someone else's chaos. Stand firm. Reclaim your clarity. And remember, in the end, the real danger is never out there. It's in the ways you betray yourself to feel wanted.